Shah and Law Shah. We're here today to honor 5 Irishmen who died in the cause of Irish freedom. Volunteer Joseph Patrick Begley, Volunteer Lieutenant James O'Donoghue, Volunteer Captain John Galvin, Volunteer Lieutenant Michael McLean, and John Reagan. There is different accounts of how these individuals died, which I guess is not to be unexpected. Sometimes in history we think we know all that occurred, and sometimes we don't, and we should be, I guess, modest in terms of our knowledge. There are probably people here today who have relatives who know much of the story, and it would be good to hear from them today because they probably know more than the rest of us. We do know that there are 3 volunteers, Joe Begley, James O'Donoghue, and John Galvin, who were killed at the same time, 2nd of December, in part of, I guess, what you would call the intelligence struggle or battle with the British Crown and the British forces. The Irish volunteers had to face not only the British military, but the British intelligence forces. And when we talk about the risks that the volunteers took throughout this time and this period, and we've been trying to talk about that and get people to appreciate it, and the bravery and the courage that they showed, and the necessity for us to honor that bravery and to courage. But one of those items, one of those risks that they took was that they were targets of British intelligence and the Crown forces. And the Republican forces did an amazing job of trying to counter that, the British intelligence forces. And for much of that time they were successful. But it was inevitable, given the power and the history and the resources of British intelligence, that there would be occasions when they would be successful. And the volunteers, as a result, would give their lives. And with the case of the 3 volunteers, Begley, O'Donoghue, and Galvin, it appears from what we can understand that that is something of what happened. And the story starts when 2 members of the Essex regiment in Bandon, Privates Thomas Watson or Watling and Percy Taylor, left their quarters, claiming to be apparently deserters or unhappy with life in the barracks, and they were taken under custody by the Republican forces. One of these Taylor said that he had a brother within the Bandon barracks who was willing to cooperate in order to give information so that a successful attack on the barracks might be made. And so he was told to write a letter addressed to Tom Barry and arrange a meeting on the 2nd of December at Laurel Walk, where it meets the Bandon to Dunmanway Road. Of course, this was obviously a risky venture for the volunteers. They were quite aware that this could be a trap. They were intelligent enough to know that that could be the case. But the potential benefits of getting information that might lead to the capture of the Bandon barracks was a risk that they had to take. Throughout this war, they were outnumbered, outgunned. The resources they had were courage and audacity. And so when an opportunity like this came, they would try and take it. They'd had similar audacity and similar luck in the taking of the Mallow barracks, and we commemorated that event back in September. There they had inside information from volunteers who were working within the barracks, and they were able to use that information in order to a successful capture of the barracks. But in this case, they did not have that same luck. They were facing a higher risk. They were getting information from the enemy and had to decide how to use it, if at all. According to Tom Barry, his instructions were for John Galvin, who was a company commander of the Bandon, to meet him at a certain point, and that the 2 of them were to go off and to scout the area around which this meeting place was supposed to take place with a member from the Essex regiment. John Galvin, or Galvin, Irish Sean or Galvin, was Captain F Company, 1st Bandon Battalion. He was only 18 years old at the time. He had worked at his uncle's garage on South Main Street in Bandon and was one of 8 children. He was raised by his aunt and his uncle in Kilcoman. He had joined the volunteers in 1919. As I said, luck was a big factor, or the lack of luck, in this particular occasion. Tom Barry suddenly got ill, got violent chest pains and lay unconscious. He eventually wound up at the Mercy Hospital in Cork. He had a displaced heart. He was out of commission for some time. Again, when you think about something like that, when someone who's that seriously ill, not only did he continue on in the struggle But of course, he commanded the forces at Crossbarry just a few months later. He also was willing to take risks of his own health and his own safety to continue for the fight for freedom and self-determination. But in the meantime, because of his condition, the message did not get through to Galvin. Galvin went along with Section Commander Joe Begley and Volunteer Lieutenant James O'Donoghue towards the meeting place to find out what information they could get to help them try and capture the barracks. Joseph Patrick Begley, who was apparently 23 years old, was one of 7 children. He was the older brother of Flora Begley, who was a member of the Flying Column. He was famously the piper at Crossbarry, the Battle of March in 1921. Joseph Patrick Begley was one of only 6 members of the Bandon Company to parade on Easter Sunday, 1916. And after the Easter Rising, himself and Flora were both taken to Cork jail. The other volunteer who died that day was Lieutenant James O'Donoghue, who was only 18 years old. He was from Shannon Street in Bandon, which is now Oliver Plunkett Street. He was one of 5 children, and his father was a general foreman at Allman's Distillery in Bandon. According to Tom Barry, the plan would have been for Galvin to go alone, and he probably would have asked the other 2 volunteers to turn back, because according to him, only Galvin was supposed to be there. But in any event, the 3 of them were taken by surprise and killed by members of the Essex regiment, and they died on that day, December 2nd, 1920. The other individuals that we're talking about, Lieutenant Michael John McLean died this day 100 years ago. He was a member of the Leckham Company, and he died following an unsuccessful IRA ambush at Galvin. There were about 4 different accounts of what took place, different versions, different emphasis. So again, the actual facts and details are we're not necessarily able to determine that with certainty. What happened is there was an attempt at an ambush. Shots were fired at a lorry. The lorry, though, was able to make it through, and the members of that lorry got out of their vehicle and doubled back to try and surround the volunteers. McLean was apparently at a house, the Duke household. He was apparently captured there and then shot by the Crown forces. And the other individual that we wanted to commemorate today is a John or a Dennis Reagan, who was 22. He was apparently a civilian. He was referred to by Tom Barry as being a civilian. And he was killed on December 7th, 1920. He lived in Knockaville outside of Bandon, and was one of 5 children, described parents as being of the poor, laboring people. Reagan had worked for a farmer, Dennis Flynn of Galvin. Both of them had been arrested. Flynn was eventually released, but Reagan was not. His body was discovered later that day. He'd been shot through the head, and his death was ruled a homicide. His parents sought unsuccessfully to get compensation for the death of their son. None of the soldiers that took their son from Clonakilty to Bandon was even called to give evidence. The deaths, of course, of volunteers and civilians was not uncommon. Civilians especially bore the brunt of this period of history. Current estimates are there were about 166 civilian deaths in the 1919 to 1921 period in Cork alone, the single largest category of fatalities. Civilians also, of course, faced destruction of their homes and property. Mick mentioned the burning of Cork, which is the anniversary is coming up on December 11th, the destruction by the Crown forces of the commercial center of the city. Of course, millions of pounds in damage, the loss of jobs, and it was a crime against the Irish people. But the Irish people did not quell in the face of this oppression. They demanded and were determined to fight for their rights and to insist upon their rights. And these rights were set forth by Tony reading out the Easter Proclamation. These were the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and the unfettered control of Irish destinies. This was the right to national freedom and sovereignty. This was the right to religious and civil liberty. This was the right to equality. This was the right of a government that represents the whole nation in all its parts, a national government representative of the whole people of Ireland. In other words, a united country. This was what the volunteers who gave their lives in Bandon and other places in Cork and Ireland. This was the principles for which they gave their lives. It was encouraging last week when we had the turnout for the Kilmichael Centenary to see that there were people here in Cork who still believed in these values, who still believed in honoring the memory of those who stood for those values. In a country that does not honor these values will find itself in a very poor position. So let us be thankful that we had men and women such as these that we're here today to honor, and let us hope that Ireland always has such men and women. Go to Óglaigh.